morning, everyone. Folks at home, go ahead and say hello in the comments on Facebook. Let us know if you can hear us all right here. As always, folks at home, we invite you to participate in the conversation. The way you can do that is on the Facebook live stream comments. I'll be monitoring comments here, so feel free to share your comments in the Facebook chat, and we will bring those into our conversation. Welcome. Go ahead and say hello if you're out there at home, and welcome to our folks who are here in the chapel. We are today halfway through this summer series using a DVD curriculum by a gentleman named Bob Goff called Everybody Always: Becoming Love in a World Full of Setbacks and Difficult People. So as we as a church are thinking about living out our vision of following Jesus everywhere, at the heart of all of those God-sized dreams is loving other people. But oftentimes loving people is not easy. And so in this series, Bob has been telling us stories from his life about what it might look like to love people when it isn't always straightforward, when it isn't always clear how, when it requires courage or thinking outside the box. And he certainly is a guy who thinks outside the box. He's had all sorts of misadventures that we've heard about over the last couple of weeks. Some of us really resonated with those. Some of us maybe thought, that's kind of weird, but his stories get us thinking. And so we are going to hear him tell some more stories today about what it might mean to love people, sometimes in ways that are difficult. So to get us started today, we are going to read this little introduction that Bob wrote to this lesson. We'll hear more from him, of course, in his own voice in the video, but I wanted to start us off with this little reflection here. Bob writes, Jesus used to really irritate the religious people of his day. They were always getting mad at something he said or did, especially when it came to the poor. One time, some of these folks were questioning Jesus' authority. They thought Jesus didn't have the right to say all the stuff he was saying. Jesus responded by telling a story, as he often did, and then ended with this statement to the religious elite. Truly, I tell you, the tax collectors and the prostitutes are entering the kingdom of God ahead of you. That's from Matthew 21, verse 31. As you can imagine, that really got under their skin. But why would Jesus say this? Tax collectors and prostitutes were considered to be the immoral folks that nobody liked. They had blown it and nosedived in their choices in all the ways these moral religious people hadn't. How could these failures at life be plugging into God's world first? Well, according to Jesus, it was precisely the fact that they had failed that made the difference. One of the things that gets in the way of us connecting with God is our self-sufficiency. Even if we follow all the rules, do all the right stuff, and pray all the right ways, we can still miss God if we're doing it all by our own strength. This is because we are most open to God when we are needy, busted, and broken. No one knows why it's that way, but that's how it is. It's in our failures that we most easily find God, not in our great achievements. This is why Jesus said the prostitutes and tax collectors were entering God's kingdom ahead of the proper religious folks. They knew all too well what it was like to be broken and needy. Society didn't work for them, and they had been pushed to the edges and looked down on because of it. However, in the great mystery of the gospel, that marginalization is exactly what opened them up to finding grace. And find it they did. This upside-down dynamic is what this session is all about. It's about getting real enough regarding our own failures to meet the God who wants nothing more than to lavish his grace on us. Yes, this can be scary. And yes, it's a risk. But God can't lavish his grace on us if we don't think we have any needs. So what about it? Are you ready for grace? If so, get ready to get real about it all as we jump into this week's teaching. Any thoughts on that little introduction here?
I was thinking, thank God, literally, for the stuff that we're going through now that feels unbelievably hard, and I personally am not handling any of it well. And so, yay, that God still loves me and is right there with me and is all going to somehow work out in this life or the next just fine.
Wow, thank you. For those at home, if you couldn't hear, Sally shared that she was actually feeling moved to thank God for some of the really hard stuff that she's going through. And trusting that that's going to work out and that God's going to use it. So yeah, this idea of actually being moved to gratitude for things that we think of as bad and struggles, that's mind-blowing. It's certainly the way that St. Paul talks in many of his letters. It's not an attitude that comes naturally to many of us. I was really struck by this line in his writing here. He says, how could these failures at life be plugging into God's world first? So one of the themes that Bob is going to talk about in his video today is this idea of failure, and how failure can often be something that really keeps us from loving people, not because of the failure itself, but because of the ways that we let it overwhelm the rest of our identity, and the way that we can often let it the way that we can often let our failures sort of blind us to God's grace rather than being avenues of God's grace. So that's what we're going to hear Bob talk about today. But before we watch the video, we're going to read one quick scripture passage here. So I'd invite you to grab a Bible. Folks at home, you can grab a Bible here in the chapel. We have some in the pews. And if we could get a volunteer to read a short passage, it's just 4 verses. We're going to read Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 to 4. Matthew 6, 1 to 4. Somebody have that looked up who'd be willing to read it out loud? I can read it here. Matthew 6, 1 to 4. Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven. So when you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Truly I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you give to the needy, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving may be in secret. Then your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. All right. So why do you think that announcing your righteousness in front of others is hypocritical? It turns people off? Yeah, that's certainly true. What else? Yeah, Linda.
It's funny, I think, it was just yesterday, I went in, and this man I've never seen before, all of a sudden he starts talking to me, and he started talking religion, and I felt that way yesterday. He asked me a couple questions and stuff, and so I answered, which was nothing wrong with it really, but I felt just this. I started telling him a couple things about it was uncomfortable. It's in me too that you just don't say stuff.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Linda was telling a story about feeling uncomfortable when someone was asking her questions about things that she was doing in service of others, and feeling about, on one hand, wanting to answer those questions, but also feeling like maybe that's not what she should do. And that raises a great tension here about where's the line between authentically telling our stories and being open about the way that God is using us versus this kind of bragging that this passage seems to be warning about. So yeah, Sally.
I like what Linda just said too. To me, I see life as a ladder, and am I trying to move myself up, or am I trying to move others up by setting an example? So I do think we're called to share, but to lift others up, as opposed to putting ourselves above them.
Yeah, thank you. So Sally says that she does think we're called to share, but it's a question of motive. Are we trying to put ourselves up, or are we sharing what we're sharing to raise others up? And one would hope for those of us who are Christians to raise God up and to glorify God. Yeah, it sure seems like here in, verse 1, there's this warning about doing things to be seen by others, if that's our motivation, versus doing things authentically. Yeah.
Another thing is that when we take credit for giving something, we have to remember, where did we receive it from?
Ooh.
It's God's blessings to us, and should we really take credit for something that we receive?
Yeah, thank you, Sally. She says if we have to be careful about taking credit, because if we have done something through God's power and through God's gift, and does God get the credit or do we get the credit? Yeah, thank you for that.
When I was a kid, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing. That used to puzzle me. Why?
Yeah, she says this verse, don't let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, is puzzling. It sure is. What does that mean? Seems to me like it's a figure of speech, that we're not literally expected to, somehow keep our hands from ever working together. But the idea of just being so unconcerned with getting credit, with showing off, that we're not even trying to show off to ourselves, maybe. Well, Bob is going to dig into all of these themes and more in today's session.
I think there's a problem.
All right, we think there might be a problem here. KG's on it. All right, so we'll get ready to watch this session. I'd invite you to grab some paper and jot down some notes, because we're going to have some time to talk. Folks at home, you can grab some paper and a pen. We have some note papers right here. And do write down lines or concepts that jump out at you and that you want to talk about. And so we'll watch Bob here, and then we'll have some time for discussion. For Bob Goff, Everybody Always Session 3. Bear with us, we are having a moment of technical difficulties, but KG's on it. We'll be right back here in just a sec. You've got extra time to grab your notepad and pen.
There you go.
was a young guy, my parents made me take piano lessons. They thought it would be good for me, kind of like spinach for my fingers. And so there was this piano teacher. I think she was pretty old, probably we spent over 40 at the time. And she would come every week, and she would give me these assignments to play. And every time I hit a wrong note, she'd cringe. And I just liked her face would like kind of pucker up, just like a prune. And so sometimes I would hit wrong notes just to see it happen again. But I remember after a while, there was a piano recital. And the thing about piano recitals is you need to nail it, right? There's a stage and a great big piano audience for waiting to hear you do it. The problem was this, there was this guy named Craig, and he had the same piano teacher. And they assigned the same song to both of us. It was called Through a Lighthouse Window. And so when the day came for the big piano recital, we both showed up, and here was the intimidating thing. Greg was one of these guys that just got everything right. I mean, he could rebuild engines, he was like probably training chord futures, and he was only 9. So Greg got out here, he was wearing a tux. He flipped his tails back behind him, sat down at the piano, and just played Through a Lighthouse Window flawlessly. He didn't make one single mistake. And when he finished and hit the last note, he raised his hands up above his head like claw fingers. And the whole audience erupted. I mean, greatness had arrived. And it was Greg. Well, I was the next guy to be up, and so I walked out in this crazy cardigan sweater my parents got at Penny's and some pants, and I looked pretty lame. And I sat down at the piano, and I looked at all the keys, and there were so many of them. I didn't know where to start. So I thought, well, I'll just start on all of them. You guys, it was horrible. My rendition of Through a Lighthouse Window was full of mistakes and flaws. It took me twice as long to get through it as it took Craig, because I just fumbled my way. And at the end, when I hit the very last note, I didn't put my claw fingers over my head. I put my head on the keys. I was pathetic. I looked like Charlie Brown, and one or two people gave one of these sympathy claps, but you know what, you guys? That was the last day I ever played the piano, until I got to college. I had a dorm next to the recital hall, and I'd go by the door and look inside, and there was a huge black grand piano on the stage like this, and I would look through, and when I looked through, I remember how ashamed I was when I sat down and played it. It looked like a hearse with a bunch of keys on it. And for a year, I passed that thing without going in. And then one day, I saw that no one was inside, and I walked up to the stage like this, and I sat down to play Through a Lighthouse Window. And you know what, you guys? I nailed it. I didn't make one mistake. I hadn't played it in 10 years. And when I hit my last note, I raised my huge claw fingers over my head. Like I wasn't Greg. If we over-identify with some of the mistakes that we've made, if we think our life is a recital, then we really miss some of the best parts that God built into us. If you've listened to good jazz, people just tap their foot. You get playing in the key of Jesus with your life, and there's no wrong notes. But what you end up doing is you learn how to live into the life God gave you to play your song, instead of playing somebody else's song. I'll tell you, what I learned about the piano recital is this. There's a thing called finger memory. What our fingers will do is do what our mind tells it to do. And so these finger memory is these grooves that have been carved into our brain. They let our fingers go. It's why you don't need to look at your cell phone when you press a phone number. It's why you don't need to look at the keyboard when you're typing a message. And what we'll remember most is the things that we've done the most often.
And I think the message of Jesus to his friends was this: to just remember him over and over and over. Make him your finger memory. One of the friends Jesus had asked him, hey, what are we supposed to do? In the book of John, he said, this is your work, to believe in the one God sent. He didn't want us to do a recital. He wanted us to know him. And I hope that you'll be thinking about that in your own life, that the times where you felt like instead of just living out your faith, you were actually showing off your faith. It was a recital. You were trying to hit all the right notes. And then also reflect on the times where you've hit a couple wrong ones. You know, I teach a class in this very room. It's a failure class. And every year, I get 300 or 400 students that sign up for this thing. And we talk about failure. And what happens, because what happens sometimes in our societies, we're talking about the big win and how awesome it was. And you think you're a winner if you won, and you think you're a loser if you lost. But most of us are a combination of both. We hit a couple wrong notes. It doesn't make us a winner, it doesn't make us a loser. It made us a participant because we tried. We're not defined by our biggest failure. We're not defined by our biggest success. We're turning into love. That's the promise. If we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus instead of the audience, then what we'll do is we'll just not go for the applause of other people. You want a bunch of applause? Join the circus. You want Jesus? Find people who failed big. And then come to them. There's something that happens. Remember we were talking last time about catching people on the bounce. That's what we do. We tell people not what they want. Remember, we tell them who they are. And we're not the sum of all of our failures. So stop over-identifying with yours. And I know it can be a little bit intimidating. And in Acts 2 and 4, it said they broke bread together and they had all things in common. And their numbers were added to daily. What they had is people that were joining them over and over again. And what failure will do is it'll isolate us. It'll steal your lunch money. It will leave you all alone. Find somebody who's messed up. Tell them it ain't a piano recital. This is your life, and it's going to be marked with a couple things that go right and a couple things that go wrong. But don't isolate yourself from people. And it's kind of easy for us to do. Honestly, Sweet Marie and I, while we spend a lot of time with people, we're actually super, super private. That we have this, I'm this extroverted introvert. But I was thinking about the way that Jesus spent time with people, and he spent it together. He didn't do it in isolation. So we had an idea. Well, we called this thing Living Room. We sent out a message on Twitter. We said, you know, we can fit about 30 or 40 people in our living room if they squeeze in tight. So next week at 10 a.m. on Thursday, we'll open it up. The first 40 people that sign up, you can come over to our living room and we'll just talk. I'm not going to live in isolation anymore. Well, in the first 4 minutes on Thursday when it came, 800 people signed up. And we said to the first 40, well, come on over. What we did a short time later, I rented a building next to Disneyland. And we all met in this beautiful space, and we had these beautiful conversations about people who have failed, who messed up, but who got back up again. When we did this gathering next to Disneyland, instead of having like breakouts in different rooms, you know what I did? I bought tickets to Disneyland for everybody. It was awesome. We had people that were afraid of things meet at the Haunted Mansion. And I had a speaker speaking there. People that wanted to know about their future. They went to Tomorrowland. It was awesome. I was at Tom Sawyer Island. Somebody else was on Main Street that served the poor. I had like a rapper in the Magic Castle and somebody with Kid President in Toontown. There's something beautiful about going to beautiful places with people and having discussions at the right place. Remember that? Do that. Your small group right now is a safe place to have those discussions, where you can just say, here's when the recital went really bad and what I did next. One of the things that's happened to me in the past year is I've been traveling to one of the schools that you guys helped build in Iraq. And I woke up in the morning and I couldn't see out of my right eye. I was like, oh shoot. And like a knucklehead, I went to 5 more countries before I got back to San Diego to see the eye doctor. The eye doctor said, buddy, you are the stupidest smart guy I've ever met before. I'm like, wait till you hang out with me longer. And so we've been doing all these operations on it to see if we could make it work again. And before every operation, I asked the doctor, how much am I going to be able to see and when? And you know what? She won't tell me. She always says the same thing. She says, Bob, you're gonna see more. And because this is somebody I trust, I'm okay with that. And you know what the promise of Scripture is to you and me? That we're gonna see more. We're gonna see more of Jesus in our lives. The more we see Jesus in the lives of the people who have failed. Instead of moving away from them, our idea is to move towards them, not just to be nice, but to be Jesus. That's what he did. Constantly move towards people who messed up. Not to just say something really nice to them and pat them on the head, but to just say, I can join you in those failures. In fact, sometimes I wonder if God leads us towards failures so we know and need him more. There's something beautiful that'll happen. Well, one of the things that I've learned by having the sight go out of this right eye is I know what my blind spot is. It's half. I look at a crowd, I'm like, you guys aren't here, I'm talking to you. Know what your blind spot is. I pull up to intersections these days, and I'm awesome at left-hand turns, but right-hand turns is like rock, paper, scissors. Coming through. Know your blind spot. And some of the people that have been creeping you out don't know theirs. And so instead of feeling like it's a recital and you're telling them what to do, just continue to remind them who they are. And there's something that will be beautiful that will happen in your life. There's a guy that was blind. I read the stories now about the blind guys. I'm like, these are my people. He was blind, and Jesus spit into some dirt and put it in his eyes, and he says, what do you see? And you know what? The guy leveled with Jesus. He said, you know what? I see people, but they look like trees. Man, if Jesus did something to heal my eyesight and it didn't work, I'd lie to him. Literally, I wouldn't want him to look bad. But you know what? Jesus didn't have a miracle that misfired. What he wanted to know, I betcha, is can you get real enough with me to say I'm not fixed yet? And you know what? Because that guy got real with Jesus, Jesus touched him again. And I think one of the things that we might need as a community of faith is a second touch. Maybe you need a second touch. And it isn't about just saying a big prayer. It's leveling with Jesus, getting real with some of the people you're with in your small group, and then just saying, you know, honestly, I need a second touch from God. And I think what happens is we end up seeing more. One of the men that came out on this stage with me is a good friend of mine. His name is Lex. And Lex lost his sight in both eyes when he was 8 years old. But by the time he got to college, you know what he figured out? He could run like the wind. So you know what Lex did? He went out for the track team. Now that seems like a bad idea to me, but do you know what Lex has? He's got a friend. And his friend runs in front of him and calls his name. You know, and on our last day here on earth, you and I, we're going to have room for about 8 people around our bed. 9 if they're thin. And I figured out who my 8 people are. And I've sent them all text messages. I said, you're one of the 8. They're like, what's that mean? I'm like, don't worry about it. But if you don't have 8 friends, go find 6. Do you know 4 fruit trees is just a bunch of fruit trees, but 5 fruit trees is an orchard? Who comes up with this stuff? Probably a lawyer like me who needs a tax break. Go find an orchard full of friends. And if you can't find 5 friends, you go find 1 friend that you can really level with to say, I need a second touch from God. And I'll tell you, beautiful things will start unfolding. You'll move off the recital stage and into community. You'll get real with each other. You'll understand that failure is what God uses to remind us of our tremendous need for him. Well, Lex, turns out, could run pretty fast, but he could also jump pretty long. And he had to pick an event. And do you know the event he picked in the track and field? The long jump. Now, that seems like a really, really bad idea. You run down a 2.5-foot wide path for 110 feet 6 inches. You jump off a board you can't see and throw your body towards a sandpit as far as you can. It seems impossible. Do you know what Lex has? He's got a friend. And his friend stands at the edge of the sand pit and calls his name. Lex, 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 Lex. And Lex just runs towards a voice he can trust. Well, Lex was evidently pretty good at the long jump. Do you know why? He went out for the United States Olympic team and he made it. Is that crazy? He literally went to Rio representing us. In the run-up to the Olympics, there's an event called the World Games. And Lex was there with his friend. His friend stood at the edge of the sand pit and started calling Lex's name. And Lex ran as fast as he could. He jumped huge, but because Lex is blind, he doesn't always run in a straight line. And he was crooked when he took off. And he missed the sand pit completely. And he crashed and burned on the concrete. Man, that's happened to you. That's happened to me. We jumped big for something that we wanted bad, and we crashed and burned. I would be tempted, if I was Lex, to bail on the whole thing. I'd just say, I'm out. I jumped huge. I hit hard. I'm out. But you know what Lex has? He's got a friend. And his friend got him a new uni because he was mooning everybody. And he walked him back 110 feet 6 inches, squared up his shoulders to the sand pit, went over there and started calling his name again. Lex, 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 Lex. Straight, straight, straight. Lex uncorks the biggest jump of his life. Set the record. Gold medal. You guys, I want us to jump further because we've fallen before. Not to hold back. Not to be afraid, not to play it safe, but to just jump big. And if we do that, if we're willing to jump big into the future that God has for us, notwithstanding the times that we've fallen in the past, if we're willing to catch people on the bounce, to find people that are creeping us out and engage them with love, do you know what? People will see Jesus. They'll look right through us. It's crazy. I'm a lawyer. I keep secrets for a living. And so when I come home at the end of the day, I can't tell Maria how my day was because I gotta just keep it to myself. But you know what? We got one of these in our living room. And so what I do is I'll sit down at the piano and I'll just play for her how my day was. If it was a really great day, I'll be on the white keys. It's be kind of chewy. If it was kind of like an awkward, kind of sad day, I might be in the minor notes. And if it was a really bad day, I'll just bang all the keys. And you know what she'll say to me every time? Tell me more about your day. And I think that's what Jesus says to us. Tell me more. Get real with me about where you really are at. He wants us to play our song. He doesn't need it to be a recital. Don't do it for the applause. Get real enough with the people that are around you. If you don't have 8, go find 1 or 2 that you can just say, I need a second touch. And there's something beautiful that will happen in you. You'll start realizing more about who God is turning you into. Not somebody standing on the corner with all the mistakes that you've made, but seeing who you're becoming. All right, you guys, thanks a million. What a great time to share a couple stories with each other now. See you.
Well, Bob crammed a lot into that little segment. So what are the things that you wrote down that caught your attention? Friends at home, you can share in the Facebook chat what you're thinking. What did you write down?
That playing it safe will steal your joy.
Ooh, that playing it safe will steal your joy. If we're so worried about making mistakes or doing the wrong thing or embarrassing ourselves, it'll steal our joy. Yeah.
I think a lot of times, because of fear, many of us, myself, I would say, might not step out because we're afraid of what might come up. Even though in my head, I know God is with me, I still have that little thing, ooh, is that going to be like,
Yeah.
But I like that still joy.
Right.
When I have stepped out, I have that joy.
Yeah. Anne says that at the times that she has stepped out, she has had joy. Yeah. I'm imagining using this image that Bob was playing with of, being on the stage of the recital and just fixating on all of the people in the audience and worrying about how they're going to judge you. And it sure seemed like for him that got in the way of his playing the piano authentically. It was only when he was in a, classroom in his college campus that he was able to actually not worry about what are people thinking and am I going to mess up and what if I do it badly, and actually just start to play and enjoy the music. He brought up this idea of over-identifying with our mistakes, of sort of having this idea about either ourselves or about other people, that really the core of who we are is the bad stuff that we've done. Is that something you found to be a temptation? And what have, if anything, have you found that helps with that?
I think for me, shame is what stability.
Yeah.
It's what, when you have a failure, the shame of it kind of keeps you from reaching out and sharing.
Yeah. Sally brings up the idea of shame, that if we have a failure and we're so worried about how that's going to be received, that shame just draws us deeper into ourselves and pulls us away from other people. Yeah, Linda.
I was wondering about myself, and I won't know the answer, I guess. I don't know what happened, but it must have been something that happened to me when I was young and don't remember that was profound, because I have had test phobia, really bad. And ever since, I don't remember much until about 5th grade on. And I almost didn't finish college, and it was so important to me to get that degree that I forced myself that whatever I have to take, I can't not show up for this final, or I don't graduate. And I thought, if I fail, I guess I fail, but if I don't go, then I'm not going to get it. I failed anyhow, kind of to myself. And I forced myself to go with statistics. And I passed and I got my degree, and stuff, but I had to do everything I could to get myself there to do it and not go blank.
Yeah.
Which I can or something. And that just made me feel so much better. And I thought, why didn't I do this years before? Because I would stop, I'd go clear up something and then get scared and stop.
Yeah.
And I realize now, I would have, in most cases, I would have been okay.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Linda. She was telling a story about test-taking phobia in school. And, knowing the material, but just having this anxiety about having to go and take the test and drawing a blank, and having to really force herself to even walk into the classroom to sit down and take the test. Yeah. We've got some folks chiming in here from home. One person says, Bob tells some fun stories, but man, today he is calling us to serious spirituality through relationships and admitting we need more of God, to admit we've fallen and to get up and jump big. Yeah. And that really was at the core of a lot of these threads that he was weaving together, about moving from this place of shame and isolation into relationships and community through which we encounter God, and being willing to admit when we've messed up. Yeah.
I know this is a personal, I guess, but for myself, when I was going through my divorce and difficulties raising a daughter who dealt with addiction, that they say don't look at the audience. And I had to remember, don't look back either.
Yeah.
I just need to keep my eyes on the cross. And if I hadn't been surrounded by people in my small group and people in this congregation, I never would have made it.
Wow.
And I'm very thankful for that.
Wow. What a touching testimony. Thank you. She was sharing about going through some family difficulties and having to remember not only don't look at the audience, but don't look back. Don't dwell on those things from the past. and really the value of being surrounded by community and by church and by small groups. And it's precisely in those places when they're done right that are really, I think, the only antidote to shame.
And he also reminds us, tell people who they are.
Tell people,
Love that.
yeah, tell people who they are.
Not what they do.
Yeah. Michelle says, I need a second touch, Lord. Amen. I think a lot of us feel that way. And she goes on to say, I love that Bob tells us to go out and find just one friend. It's not too late for any of us. Go out and do. And man, that can be hard, but I think he's right that it's so important. Yeah.
My favorite person in the Bible is Peter because he made so many mistakes. And my favorite story, and I call it the greatest love story, is when Jesus was resurrected and met with Peter and said, do you love me? Feed my sheep. Do you love me? Feed my lambs. Do you love me? Feed my sheep. That all those mistakes you made, you're forgiven. Now go get busy serving me. I love that.
Yes. She says she loves the stories of Peter in the Bible because he's always making mistakes, and especially after the resurrection when he encounters Jesus. And Jesus says, do you love me? Then go feed my sheep. And he asks him 3 times, do you love me? Which parallels the 3 times that Peter denies Jesus on the night of his betrayal. And so he had said, no, I don't know this man 3 times on the night Jesus was being killed. And then after the resurrection, Jesus gives him 3 opportunities to affirm that he does know and love him, and then is called out to go and feed his sheep. Yeah.
One of the other things I like that he was talking about doing things over and over, and that's basically muscle memory.
Muscle memory.
And
yeah.
It just seems like the more we study Jesus and the more we're around people who love Jesus, the more likely we're to act as the way he wants us to act and the things that he wants us to do.
Yeah. The more time we spend with Jesus and the more time we spend with people who are like Jesus, the more we get that muscle memory, just like practicing the piano, of being like Jesus. Yeah.
You can't memorize a lot of verses.
Right. Yeah. Bob calls us to keep your eyes fixed on Jesus and not on the audience. So not only does being fixated on the audience sort of send us into this shame and fear spiral, but it keeps us from having our eyes where they really should be, on Jesus. Yeah. I love the line where he's contrasted living out our faith versus showing off our faith like a recital. And he says we're called to move off of the recital stage and into a community. And those are 2 fundamentally different ways of being with other people, of feeling like we have to perform versus being part of a community where we can grow in this muscle memory. And that's what we're trying to do in, our Bible studies and in adult ed and in our worship and in the life of the church. We're trying to develop that muscle memory to learn how to play like Jesus. Yeah. He talked a bit in this video about the idea of small groups. And some of us have those kind of informal networks of supportive community. Others of us have found real life in more formalized groups. And mark your calendars, because the first Sunday in August, during this adult ed hour, Wendy Smith and Susan Weichert, who is the chair of the fellowship committee, are going to be having sort of a rally to help learn about new opportunities for forming small groups here at FPC. So if that's something that you feel like you might be interested in, if you're wondering, how do I find those 6 friends? Small groups might be one way to do that. And there'll be a small group event that first Sunday in August.
I was thinking also about the second touch thing.
Yeah.
We sometimes need second touches from our community, from our friends, but it reminds me of the times I might do something and then I do it again and I go to God and I ask I've done this again, please Lord, help
Amen.
We're all works in progress.
Amen. We're all works in progress. We all constantly have to go back to God and say, help me, show me mercy, and that God is faithful and God does. And we even get to ritualize and remember that in our worship every single week as we get real and confess our sins to God and then hear those beautiful words of God's forgiveness and God's faithfulness. And we actually even say them to each other. And I think that's one of the ways that we help even in our rituals of worship, reminding one another to fix our eyes on Jesus as we tell each other we're forgiven. Well, to close here, I'll just read one final passage from Bob. I don't know about you, but I've gotten to the end of the day more than a few times and realized my untucked shirt was uneven at the bottom. I'm usually just one button off, but sometimes two. The fact is, some of the people who have shaped my faith the most were a couple of buttons off on theirs. They've made some big mistakes. Run toward those people, not away. There is a quiet confidence in knowing we all hit a couple of wrong notes here and there. The report card on our faith is how we treat one another when we do. Mary ran to the tomb a couple of days after Jesus had been buried and rose again, and she thought Jesus was the gardener. He didn't embarrass her in front of everybody and tell her all the reasons why she was wrong. He didn't have a Bible study with her about it either. Do you know what he did? He just said her name, Mary. That's all. It was the shortest sermon ever given. We don't need to send the archers to the tower to protect baby Jesus every time someone hits a wrong note. Read the book of Revelation. He's out of the crib. Should we have a firm grip on doctrine and know what the Bible speaks to the world? You bet. Keep this in mind, though. Loving people the way Jesus did is always great theology. Memorize this. Memorize grace. Make it your finger memory. Lose the stages. Your faith isn't a recital. Speak some jazz into people's lives when they miss a couple of notes. Run to them. Don't give them advice. Say their names. Right, well, there's so much more we could say about this, but thank you for being part of this conversation this morning. And we invite you back next week at 9:40, both here in the chapel and on the live stream. And our topic next week is look at what's in your bucket. So we'll find out what that means next Sunday.